The morning my stepson handed me papers to sign, I recognized every clause. 28 years as a legal accountant will do that. What I didn't recognize, what I never saw coming, was that the real threat wasn't him at all. It was the woman sitting quietly behind him, smiling. The grocery bags weren't heavy. 2 of them a rotisserie chicken, a carton of milk, a bunch of bananas that were just beginning to spot at the tips the way Gerald always liked them. She had picked up a magazine at the checkout lane, one of those thick fall issues with a pumpkin on the cover, because October had always been her favorite month, and old habits died hard. Connie Hayward had lived in that house on Clover Mill Road for 22 years. She knew every sound it made, the way the second porch step creaked on the left side, the way the front door stuck a little in humidity, the way the deadbolt turned with just enough resistance to remind you it was doing its job. So when she slid her key in and it stopped cold, she didn't rattle it. She didn't force it. She simply stood still for a moment, the way she had learned to stand still in 31 years of forensic accounting, when a number didn't add up, quiet, observant, letting the situation speak before she did. She tried the key again, smooth resistance, not a stuck lock, a changed one. She stepped back. That's when she saw them 2 black garbage bags sitting at the far end of the porch, tied at the top, the kind you used for lawn clippings or things you'd decided were no longer worth keeping. She recognized the corner of a picture frame poking against the plastic, the edge of a cardigan she'd had for 15 years, a pair of shoes, their soles pressing unevenly against the bag's side. Her things. She turned toward the front window. Ryan was standing just inside the glass, her late husband Gerald's son, from his first marriage, 29 years old, broad-shouldered the way Gerald had been broad-shouldered, with eyes that were doing everything they could to avoid meeting hers. He was dressed like a man who had somewhere important to be, in a button-down that still had the fold creases in it, the kind you put on when you're trying to look like an authority you don't quite feel. Behind him, a step back and slightly to the left, stood Sasha. Connie had met Sasha 14 months ago at a Sunday dinner that Gerald had arranged with careful optimism. She was 32, sharp-featured, with the particular kind of stillness that belonged to people who were always calculating distances. She hadn't said much that evening, but she had looked at everything in that house the way an appraiser looked at things assigning value, noting what could be moved, what could be replaced, what was simply in the way. Ryan was not meeting Connie's eyes. Sasha was. 28 years of sitting across from people who had rearranged numbers to tell a story that wasn't true had taught Connie one thing above all else. The person doing the talking was rarely the person running the operation. You watched the hands, not the mouth. You watched who stayed still when everyone else shifted. You watched who wasn't bothered by the silence. Ryan's jaw was tight. His hands were in his pockets, a posture she recognized as a man bracing himself for something he hadn't fully decided was right. Sasha had her arms loosely crossed, patient, settled, already certain of the outcome. Connie understood the situation completely. She didn't knock on the glass. She didn't call through the door. She didn't perform the version of this moment that Sasha had almost certainly rehearsed in her head, the tears, the pleading, the raised voice that could later be described as unstable, unreasonable, difficult. She had not spent the better part of 3 decades reconstructing financial deception just to let someone rewrite her own story in front of her face. Instead, she set both grocery bags down gently beside the porch railing, the bananas, the milk, the rotisserie chicken that was still faintly warm through the plastic. She picked up the magazine and set it on top. Neat, deliberate. Then she pulled out the chair, the old wicker one Gerald had carried home from a yard sale 7 years ago because he said it had good bones, and she sat down. The afternoon light was doing that particular October thing where it came in low and golden and made everything look like a memory already. A neighbor's dog was barking 2 houses down. Somewhere up the street, someone was raking leaves. Connie folded her hands in her lap and looked at nothing in particular. She heard movement inside, a murmur. The sound of Sasha's voice low, confident, and Ryan's response, shorter and less certain. She didn't try to make out the words. She didn't need to. The conversation happening behind that glass was one she had already read the ending of. She thought about Gerald. Not with grief, not right then, just with the particular clarity that came when she missed his steadiness most. He had always said she was the calmest person he had ever been afraid of. She used to laugh at that. She wasn't laughing now, but she understood what he meant. The light shifted. A car passed. The dog stopped barking. Connie reached into her coat pocket and found her phone. She scrolled to a name she hadn't called in 4 months, not since the funeral, not since the weeks after, when everything had been arrangements and paperwork and long silences over coffee. Beverly Marsh, her closest friend since their days working at the same accounting firm in the early 90s, a woman who had spent her career as a paralegal and knew more about estate law in the state of Virginia than most people with a law degree. Connie pressed call. It rang twice. Connie. Beverly picked up the way old friends did, no greeting, just presence. "It's time," Connie said. 3 words, quiet as the October afternoon around her. She didn't explain. She didn't need to. Because 4 months ago, on the day they had sat together at the kitchen table after Gerald's service, Connie had told Beverly everything. The conversations she'd had with Gerald in his final months. What she suspected might happen once she was alone in that house. What she had quietly begun to prepare. Beverly had listened. Then she had said, "When the time comes, you call me first." The time had come. Connie ended the call and set the phone on her knee. She looked at the 2 garbage bags at the end of the porch, at the corner of the picture frame, at the cardigan, at the shoes. Then she looked back at the front door of the house on Clover Mill Road, where she had lived for 22 years. She wasn't leaving. Not really. She was just getting started. The porch on Clover Mill Road faded slowly. Then all at once, and what replaced it was hospital white. The particular shade that gave nothing back when you looked at it, that existed only to be clean and neutral and indifferent to whatever was happening beneath it. Connie had sat in that hallway for 4 hours before the doctor came. She watched the floor tiles. She counted the flickers of the light above the nurse's station. She did these things because they were something to do, and doing something kept the larger truth at arm's length for a little while longer. The doctor was young, with kind eyes and a careful voice. Gerald hadn't made it. The second stroke, he explained. The first had come 3 weeks earlier, the warning. The one that had put Gerald in that bed with tubes in his arm and a view of the parking garage. The one that had made him hold her hand tighter than usual in the evenings. The second came without warning, the way the worst things always did. 26 years. That was what she kept returning to, sitting alone in that hallway. Not the grief would come later, in waves, at unexpected hours. But in that moment, what she felt most was the weight of 26 years lifting all at once. The way a sound you've grown so used to you'd stopped hearing it goes suddenly silent, and the silence itself becomes the loudest thing in the room. It had not been a glamorous marriage. Gerald was not the kind of man who brought flowers unprompted or remembered anniversaries with anything more than a sheepish grin. He left his reading glasses in every room. He had opinions about the dishwasher that were frankly unreasonable, but he had been steady, profoundly, quietly steady. The kind of man who showed up, who meant what he said, who squeezed her hand when a song came on that he knew she liked. 26 years of that kind of steadiness left a shape in a life. And now that shape was empty. The service was held on a Thursday. Beverly came, a handful of colleagues, neighbors from Clover Mill Road who brought casseroles and stood quietly in the living room. Gerald's brother from Charlottesville, who cried openly and apologized for it, which made Connie love him immediately. Ryan arrived 40 minutes early with Sasha beside him. He was dressed in dark clothes, his face carrying the genuine weight of a man who had lost his father. Complicated grief, unresolved at the edges, but real. He hugged Connie at the door, and the hug was honest. She gave him that. It was Sasha she found herself watching. She hadn't intended to. She had met Sasha only 3 times before a Sunday dinner Gerald had arranged with careful optimism, a birthday lunch the following spring, and a brief accidental encounter at a farmer's market. Each time, Connie had walked away with a faint, unresolved impression of a woman who was pleasant in the way that required effort. But a memorial service was different. It was a room that demanded nothing, no performance, no pleasantries. A moment that called for stillness, even borrowed grief, even the ordinary decency of pretending to feel something for the people who did. Sasha wasn't crying. That alone meant nothing. Connie knew better than to measure grief by tears. Some people went hollow. Some people got busy. Some kept everything in until they were alone in the car. But it wasn't the absence of tears that caught her attention. It was the eyes. Sasha's gaze moved through that living room the way an inventory moved through a spreadsheet, methodical, unhurried, thorough. The painting above the fireplace Gerald had bought at an art fair in Savannah. The antique side table near the window that had belonged to Connie's mother. The bookshelves lining the far wall, filled with 26 years of accumulated reading and weekend finds, and things kept simply because they had been loved. The eyes paused, assessed, moved on. Not the eyes of someone in grief, not even the eyes of someone distracted by it, the eyes of someone doing a different kind of work entirely. Connie told herself she was being uncharitable. That loss did strange things to perception, made you read intention into neutral gestures, made you see threat in ordinary movement. She had spent a career reading people, and she knew that skill could become a curse when you were operating from a raw place. She told herself to let it go. She almost believed it. By 7 that evening, the last neighbor had said their goodbyes. Ryan stood at the door, Sasha beside him, coat already on, bag already over her shoulder. "Call us if you need anything," Ryan said. He meant it. She could hear that he did. "I will," Connie said. She watched them walk down the porch steps, watched the taillights disappear around the corner. Then she closed the front door and stood in the hallway with the silence of a house that had always held 2 people and now held 1. She stood there a long time. She was almost ready to turn off the lights when she heard it faint, carried through the window she'd left open an inch for the cool evening air. Sasha's voice, low, conversational, half a block away but perfectly clear in the quiet of the October street. "How long do you think she'll want to stay in that house alone?" Connie didn't move. She stood with her hand on the light switch and listened to the silence that followed and understood, with the cold precision of 28 years reading numbers that never lied, that the clock had already started. The clock had started. But clocks, Connie had learned, did not always announce themselves with urgency. Sometimes they arrived at the front door on a Tuesday morning with a container of chicken soup and a warm smile. It was 3 weeks after the service. The leaves on Clover Mill Road had gone from gold to rust, and the mornings had taken on that particular chill that made the house feel quieter than usual when Sasha appeared on the porch with a ceramic container in both hands and Ryan 1 step behind her, holding a small toolbox. "We just want to make sure you're okay," Sasha said. The smile was warm, genuinely warm, the kind that reached the eyes, the kind that, if you weren't paying close attention, you would simply accept as the real thing. Connie had spent enough years in rooms where people performed sincerity to know that the performance itself was a skill, and Sasha had clearly practiced hers. "That's very thoughtful," Connie said, and stepped back to let them in. The soup was good. That was the thing she kept coming back to later. It was actually good, made from scratch, the kind that took time, which told her something. Sasha was not careless. Whatever she was doing it with patience and attention to detail. Those were, in Connie's experience, the most important things to note about a person. Ryan went to work without being asked, tightened a hinge on the kitchen cabinet that had been loose for months, replaced a light bulb in the hallway fixture Connie hadn't gotten around to, looked at the slow drain in the guest bathroom with the focused expression of a man grateful to have a task that required no conversation. He was kind. She didn't doubt that. But she had begun to notice the particular rhythm of how Ryan and Sasha moved through a room together, Sasha slightly ahead, Ryan slightly behind, decisions flowing in one direction and compliance following quietly in the other. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't obvious. It was the kind of thing you only saw if you were looking for it, and most people weren't. Connie was. The financial questions started on the 3rd visit, wrapped so carefully in concern that someone not paying attention might have missed them entirely. Gerald always handled all of that, didn't he? It must be so much to navigate on your own. Ryan mentioned the property taxes on a house this size. "We just want to make sure you have support if it ever gets overwhelming." There are some really lovely communities for women your age. Not assisted living, nothing like that. Just easier, simpler. You deserve simpler, Connie. Each one delivered gently, conversationally, with the soft concern of people who only wanted what was best. Each one landing like a small stone in still water, barely a ripple on the surface, but Connie felt every one of them reach the bottom. She answered carefully, gave enough to seem open, held back everything that mattered. But it was the other thing that concerned her more, the small, almost imperceptible pattern of suggesting she had forgotten things she hadn't forgotten. "You mentioned last week you weren't sure about the account numbers, remember?" She hadn't said that. "Ryan thought you seemed a little confused about the timeline of Gerald's estate. It's completely understandable. There's so much paperwork." She had not been confused. They were small corrections, gentle ones. The kind that, over time, accumulated into a portrait a woman in her mid-50s, recently widowed, struggling a little with the details, perhaps not quite as sharp as she used to be. The kind of portrait that became useful later, in certain kinds of conversations, in certain kinds of rooms. Connie recognized the architecture of it. She had seen similar constructions in financial documents, a narrative built not with lies exactly, but with carefully selected truths arranged to point in a specific direction. She said nothing. She smiled. She offered more coffee. And she started watching more carefully. It was a Friday evening, 2 weeks after the soup, when she found it. She had been reorganizing the bookshelf in the study, not out of any particular suspicion, just the ordinary restlessness of a woman trying to find purpose in small tasks, when she noticed something on the shelf behind the row of Gerald's old architecture books. Tucked against the back wall, almost flush with the baseboard, barely visible unless you were reaching to the very back of the shelf. Small, rectangular, matte black. She didn't touch it. She stood very still for a moment, the way she stood still when a number didn't add up, and let the reality of what she was looking at settle completely before she allowed herself to respond to it. Then she reached for her phone, opened the camera, and took 3 photographs from different angles. Clear, well-lit, in focus. She put the phone back in her pocket. She slid Gerald's architecture books back into place, adjusted the shelf until it looked exactly as it had before, and walked to the kitchen, where she poured herself a glass of water and drank it slowly at the counter. That evening, when Beverly called to check in Beverly Marsh, who had been her closest friend since their years at the same accounting firm, who understood both legal fine print and the particular patience required to wait for the right moment, Connie took her phone and walked out the back door into the garden. The air was cold. The neighbor's oak tree had gone almost completely bare. She stood on the flagstone path between the dormant rose beds and spoke quietly and clearly, the open sky above her and the warm light of the kitchen window behind her. From that evening on, any conversation that mattered happened outside. She never mentioned the device. She never moved it. She never gave any indication, on any of Sasha's subsequent visits, that anything had changed. Because in Connie's experience, the most useful thing you could do when someone was listening was to be very, very careful about what you let them hear. Careful listening, Connie had always believed, was only half the work. The other half was knowing what to do with what you heard. 2 mornings after she found what was behind the bookshelf, she called Beverly. Not from the study, not from the kitchen. From the garden, standing on the flagstone path in the early November chill, her breath visible in the cold air, the neighbor's oak tree stripped bare above her. She kept her voice low and her words precise, the way she had learned to speak in depositions only what was necessary, nothing that couldn't be supported. Beverly listened without interrupting. That was one of the things Connie had always valued most about her, the particular quality of her silence, which was never empty but always full of processing. When Connie finished, Beverly said, "I'll come Saturday." She arrived at 9 with a bag over one shoulder and the focused expression of a woman who had spent 30 years as a paralegal and had learned, as Connie had learned through accounting, that the most important documents were rarely the ones people showed you willingly. They sat at the kitchen table, 2 mugs of coffee, Beverly's laptop open between them, a legal pad beside it with Beverly's handwriting already filling the top half of the first page. Connie told her everything in order. The visits, the questions about finances, wrapped in concern, the gentle suggestions that she had forgotten things she hadn't forgotten, the way Ryan moved through a room like a man following directions he hadn't written. The small rectangular device behind Gerald's architecture books, photographed and left exactly where she found it. Beverly pulled up the photographs on Connie's phone and studied them without expression for a long moment. "You didn't move it," Beverly said. "No." "Good." She set the phone down and opened a new window on her laptop. "Tell me everything you know about her. Full name, where she's from, where she worked before Ryan, anything Ryan ever mentioned." Connie told her what she had. It wasn't much. Sasha Monroe, originally from somewhere in the Mid-South, had worked in property management before she and Ryan met at a colleagues' gathering 2 years ago. Ryan had shared details sparingly, and Connie had never pushed, not wanting to seem unwelcoming before she had reason to be. Beverly wrote it all down without comment and said she would be in touch. In the meantime, Connie did what she knew how to do. She went back through the filing cabinet in the study, the one that held Gerald's estate documents, insurance records, property deeds, and the financial paperwork she had been slowly organizing since his passing. She had a system. She always had a system. 31 years of forensic work had made order second nature, the way musicians heard rhythm in ordinary sound. Everything in that cabinet had a place, and she knew every place, which was how she noticed it on the second afternoon of looking a manila folder near the back of the third drawer, slightly askew, not dramatically out of place, not the kind of thing that would register to most people. But the folder held copies of Gerald's life insurance policy and the preliminary estate summary his attorney had prepared, and Connie had filed it herself, spine flush with the hanging rail, the way she filed everything. It was now a quarter-inch forward and tilted 2 degrees to the left. She stood at the open drawer for a long moment, then pulled the folder and went through every page. Nothing was missing. Nothing had been altered. But the pages were not in the order she had placed them, and 2 of them had faint parallel creases along the top edge, the kind left by a phone camera pressed too close when someone was in a hurry. She put the folder back, adjusted it to its exact original position. Then she went to her laptop and began her own documentation, not a reaction, but a record. Dates, observations, the photographs, the folder, the pattern of questions. She organized it the same way she would have organized evidence in a professional context, chronological, factual, without editorializing, the kind of document that spoke for itself. Over the following 3 weeks, she and Beverly worked methodically. Beverly pulled public records, property filings, court indexes, professional registrations. Connie cross-referenced financial details Ryan had mentioned casually in conversation against public data she could access through her professional network. They shared notes during Connie's garden calls, in the early mornings before the neighborhood woke up, voices low and unhurried. Sasha had not left a large footprint. That itself was a data point. People who moved carefully through public records were either very private or had specific reasons to be difficult to find. Both possibilities warranted attention. They were 3 weeks in when Beverly called on a Thursday evening. Connie was in the garden before the second ring. Beverly's voice was different, not alarmed, but carrying the particular weight of someone who had just confirmed something they had half expected and were still absorbing. "I need you to sit down," Beverly said. Connie looked at the bare rose bushes along the garden path, at the rectangle of warm kitchen light behind the glass door, at the October sky going dark above the roofline. "I'm already outside," she said. "Tell me." A brief pause, the sound of Beverly steadying herself. "Sasha Monroe." That's not the name she used before, Connie. The garden went very quiet. Somewhere down the block, a car door closed. The kitchen light flickered once behind the glass. Connie said nothing. She waited the way she always waited, still, precise, giving the silence room to finish what it had started. The silence in that garden had lasted exactly 4 seconds. Connie knew because she counted them, an old habit from deposition rooms, where silence had weight and the person who filled it first usually had something to lose. She had let Beverly fill it, and Beverly had said the only thing left to say, "I'll have everything together by morning." She had. Beverly arrived at 8:30 with a folder thick enough to suggest she hadn't slept much. She set it on the dining room table, not the kitchen this time, because what was in that folder required more space, the kind of lateral spread that let you see things side by side and understand what you were looking at. Connie poured the coffee and sat down across from her and didn't say anything. She just waited. Beverly opened the folder. The name Sasha had used before was Sandra Myers. She had married Daniel Ellison 4 years ago in Nashville. Daniel was 58, a widower, a man who had spent 30 years building a modest but solid commercial real estate portfolio and who had, by all accounts, been quiet, careful, and genuinely kind. They had met through mutual acquaintances. The courtship had been brief, but apparently unremarkable. No one had thought much of it at the time. Daniel passed away 14 months after the wedding. Cardiac event unexpected, at least to the people around him. He had been in reasonable health, no prior history. His affairs were in order. The estate transferred cleanly. Beverly set a photograph on the table. A woman in her early 70s, silver-haired, wearing a blue cardigan, standing in front of a small house with flower boxes under the windows. Her name was Patricia Ellison, Daniel's mother. She had lived in that house for 31 years. 8 months after Daniel passed, she no longer did. Beverly walked Connie through it methodically, the way a good paralegal walked a client through a timeline, no editorializing, just sequence. First had come the visits. Patricia had described them later to a housing advocate. A young woman, always warm, always bringing something: food, a plant, a magazine. Always asking careful questions about the property, the finances, whether Patricia had considered something simpler, easier, more manageable for a woman living alone. Then had come the suggestions that Patricia was forgetting things, small ones at first. A conversation Patricia was certain she'd had, gently contradicted. A date Patricia remembered clearly, softly questioned. Nothing that could be pointed to directly, just a slow, patient accumulation of doubt, the kind that, over time, made a woman begin to question her own account of things. Then had come the documents. Connie stopped Beverly there. What kind of documents? A power of attorney. Introduced as a precaution. Just in case things get complicated, Patricia. You know how paperwork can be. Witnessed by two people Patricia had met only twice. Beverly turned a page. She signed it. She told the housing advocate she hadn't fully understood what she was signing, that she'd trusted the people in the room. Connie set down her coffee cup. 8 months, she said. From first visit to Patricia leaving the house. 8 months exactly. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past on Clover Mill Road. The sound of the ordinary world, indifferent and unhurried. Connie looked at the timeline Beverly had laid out: Daniel's passing, the visits beginning, the financial questions, the memory suggestions, the documents, the house. Then she looked at her own situation, arranged in her mind with the same chronological precision. Gerald's passing, the soup, the questions about property taxes. You mentioned last week you weren't sure about the account numbers, remember? The folder in the filing cabinet moved a 1/4 inch forward. Same opening. Same sequence. Same architecture. She used the same lines, Connie said. It wasn't a question. Beverly slid a handwritten sheet across the table notes from an interview the housing advocate had conducted with Patricia 18 months ago. 3 quotes, highlighted in yellow. We just want to make sure you're okay. A woman your age, living alone in a house this size, it's a lot to manage. I think you might be misremembering that, Patricia. You've had so much on your plate. Connie read them twice. She didn't need to read them a third time. She had heard all 3, nearly word for word. In her own living room. She's done this before, Connie said, and it worked. Patricia had no documentation, no record of the visits, the conversations, the progression. By the time she understood what had happened, the paperwork was signed and the house had changed hands through a series of transfers that were each individually legal. Beverly closed the folder. She spent 2 years trying to get someone to listen. Most people were sympathetic. No one could do anything. Where is she now? Apartment in Murfreesboro, her daughter's place. Beverly paused. She's 71. Connie looked at the photograph again. The blue cardigan, the flower boxes. The expression of a woman photographed in front of something she'd loved and no longer had not grief exactly, but the particular settled quality of someone who had made peace with a loss they hadn't chosen. 4 years. Patricia Ellison had been carrying this for 4 years without anyone able to help her. I need to talk to her, Connie said. Beverly reached into the side pocket of the folder and produced a single index card, set it on the table between them. I already found the address. Connie picked up the index card. She looked at the address, a street in Murfreesboro she'd never heard of, a zip code far from Nashville's center. Then she looked back at the photograph. Patricia Ellison had believed the people in her house, had trusted the warmth, the soup, the careful concern, had signed something she didn't fully understand because the room had been arranged to make refusal feel unreasonable. She had not been foolish, she had been human. And she had waited 4 years for someone to arrive who understood exactly what had happened to her. Not this time, Connie thought. Not to Patricia. And not to herself. The decision had been made in that dining room on Clover Mill Road. The drive to Murfreesboro was just the distance between deciding and doing. Beverly drove. 4 hours south on I-81 and then I-40, through the long Blue Ridge corridor where the mountains flattened gradually into Tennessee farmland. They didn't talk much. Connie spent most of the drive looking out the window at the passing landscape fields, stubbled with the remnants of fall harvest, tree lines gone bare, sky the particular gray of a November day that hadn't decided what it wanted to do. She was organizing in her mind, The way she always organized before a meeting that mattered. What she knew, what she needed to confirm, what she was going to listen for. The building was single-story, brick, with a parking lot bordered by a low hedge that had been trimmed into submission. A modest place, clean, functional, the kind that suggested competent care without excess. A small sign by the entrance said Meadowbrook Residential Care in the kind of font chosen specifically not to alarm anyone. Inside, the air carried lavender and something sharper beneath it. The particular combination of institutional cleanliness and deliberate comfort that Connie recognized immediately as a place where people had learned to make the best of reduced circumstances. The front desk directed them down the left corridor. Room 14 was at the end. Connie stood at the door for a moment before knocking. Patricia Ellison was smaller than her photograph suggested. She sat in a chair by the window in a blue cardigan, not the same one from the photo, but the same shade, which felt meaningful somehow with a paperback open in her lap and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. The window looked out onto a courtyard with a dormant garden and a concrete birdbath that had been empty long enough to collect a ring of dried leaves around the basin. She looked up when Connie knocked on the open door. Her eyes were sharp. That was the first thing sharper than Connie had expected, the kind of sharp that came from years of paying attention to things other people let slide. The eyes of a woman who had been disbelieved often enough to have become very precise about what she observed. She looked at Connie for a long moment. Not suspicious exactly, more like someone who had waited long enough to have stopped expecting, and had not yet allowed herself to start again. "Mrs. Hayward," Patricia said. Beverly had called ahead. "You came a long way." "I did," Connie said. "I thought you deserved that much." Something shifted in Patricia's expression, not quite relief, not quite recognition, but the particular quality of a person who has said something true many times in empty rooms and is suddenly being heard. She gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit down," she said. "It's a long story." It took 90 minutes. Patricia told it carefully, in sequence, the way someone told a story they had rehearsed, not for performance but for precision, wanting to get every detail right because the details were the only proof they had. Connie listened without interrupting, without writing anything down, trusting her memory the way she trusted it in client meetings. Completely. The first visit had been a Tuesday. Chicken soup, she remembered, because she had thought it was a kind gesture and had said so. The questions about the property had started on the third visit, gentle, concerned, framed as worry. A house this size, Patricia. All by yourself, it's a lot. The suggestions that she was forgetting things had begun around the 6th week. A conversation Patricia was certain of, softly contradicted. A date remembered clearly, gently questioned. "She never called me confused," Patricia said. She was too careful for that. She would just say, "You've had so much on your plate, Patricia. It's completely understandable." And after a while, I started to wonder if maybe I was misremembering, getting things mixed up. She paused. That was the part that took the longest to forgive myself for. Connie said nothing. She let the silence hold what it needed to hold. "The documents came at month 5, Patricia continued. "A power of attorney. She brought 2 people I'd met once or twice, pleasant enough. I had no reason to distrust them. She explained it as a precaution. Said it was what responsible families did. Said Daniel would have wanted her to look after me." Patricia's voice was steady, but her hands, resting on the closed paperback, were very still in the particular way of hands that had learned not to shake. "I signed it. I didn't understand what I was signing. Not completely. And after that, things moved quickly. The house was put on the market for my benefit," she said, to simplify things. The proceeds went into an account she had access to. There were fees, she explained, management costs, transition expenses. Patricia looked out the window at the empty birdbath. "Within 8 months of Daniel passing, I was here." She said it without drama, without the performance of grief, just fact. The fact of 31 years in a house reduced to a room with a window overlooking a dormant garden and a birdbath full of dead leaves. "I reported it," Patricia said, "to 3 different offices. A housing advocate helped me file paperwork. Everyone was sympathetic. No one could do anything." She had been very careful, every step individually clean, every signature obtained, every transfer documented. She finally looked back at Connie. She took everything. And nobody believed me because she had already made sure nobody would. The room was quiet. Down the hall, a television murmured. Outside, a bird landed on the edge of the bird bath, found nothing, and left. Patricia reached across the space between their chairs and put her hand over Connie's. Her grip was firm. "Don't let her do to you what she did to me," Patricia said. Connie looked at this woman 71 years old, in a borrowed room, in a borrowed chair, in a cardigan the same shade as the one in the photograph of a life she no longer lived, and felt something settle inside her. Not anger. Something quieter and more durable than anger. "I won't," she said. They were an hour outside of Richmond, the highway dark and the car warm, when Beverly's phone lit up on the dashboard mount. She glanced at the screen, and her expression changed in the way expressions changed when a name appeared that you hadn't expected. "It's Martin Cole," Beverly said. Martin Cole, Gerald's attorney, the man who had handled the estate paperwork and whom Connie had met exactly twice, both times across a conference table with documents between them. She had not heard from him in 3 months. Beverly answered on speaker. "This is Beverly Marsh." "Miss Marsh." Martin's voice was careful in the way that lawyers' voices were careful when they were choosing their words before they spoke them. "I need to speak with Mrs. Hayward. Tonight, if possible. There's something she needs to know." A brief pause, weighted with the particular gravity of information being withheld only long enough to be delivered properly. "Please tell her it's urgent." Beverly looked at Connie. Connie looked at the dark road ahead. "Tell him we'll call when we get home," she said. The highway had been quiet all the way back to Richmond. Connie hadn't called Martin that night, not because she was avoiding it, but because certain conversations needed to happen in person, across a table, with proper light. Whatever he had to say had waited 3 months. It could wait until Monday. She called from the garden at 7 the next morning. They set the appointment for 9 o'clock. Martin Cole's office was on the 4th floor of a building on East Main Street. Dark wood paneling, bookshelves organized by subject and year, a window overlooking the street below. Martin himself matched the room. Mid-60s, deliberate, the kind of man who chose his words the way a surgeon chose instruments carefully, and only when necessary. He had been Gerald's attorney for 19 years. He stood when they entered, shook Connie's hand, then Beverly's, gestured to the chairs. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I know the weekend was long." He placed both hands flat on the desk, a gesture of a person steadying themselves before delivering something they had been carrying for some time, and opened the folder in front of him. "Gerald came to see me privately," Martin said, 11 days before he passed. The room went quiet. Outside, a truck moved down East Main. The sound faded. "He asked me to keep what we discussed confidential until he could tell you himself. When he passed before that moment came, the instruction transferred to me, wait until the situation made it necessary." He paused. "Mrs. Hayward, the situation has made it necessary." He turned the folder so she could see it. 11 days before the second stroke, Gerald Hayward had walked into this office and asked Martin to amend his will. The amendment was complete, properly witnessed, and fully binding, held in a private document safe, with no record in the general file that Ryan or Sasha would have had reason to access. It did one thing. It removed Ryan Hayward entirely from the estate. Connie read the relevant section twice. The language was precise and unambiguous, written by someone who knew exactly what he was doing and wanted no room for interpretation. "He knew," she said. "He knew something was wrong," Martin said. He couldn't name it with certainty. "But he told me he had watched Ryan change over the previous 8 months. The questions Ryan asked, the things Ryan seemed to know without being told, the way Ryan deferred to his wife in conversations where he previously would not have." Martin folded his hands. He said, and I'm quoting directly, "Ryan is a good man who is currently not making his own decisions. I love my son, but I will not leave my wife's security in the hands of someone else's agenda." Connie looked at the window. She thought about Gerald in this chair, 11 days before the end, doing what he could with the time he had, protecting what he loved in the only language he had always spoken fluently, practical action. He had always shown up, even at the end, especially at the end. "The full estate," she said. "Everything, the house, the accounts, the investment portfolio, the rental property on Dunmore Street, all of it transfers to you directly, without condition." He paused. "The original will, the one Ryan and Sasha would have known about, has been superseded entirely." Beverly was writing quietly on her legal pad. Connie said nothing. Martin reached into the lower drawer and produced a single envelope, cream-colored, sealed with care, handled gently. On the front, in Gerald's handwriting, the slightly right-leaning print she had read on grocery lists and birthday cards and notes left on the kitchen counter for 26 years was one word: Connie. He placed it on the desk between them. She looked at it for a long moment without reaching for it. She sat with the reality of it, her husband, in this room, writing her name on an envelope, trusting it to a careful man, hoping perhaps that she would never need it, that things would resolve differently, that the conversation he'd meant to have would happen before this one became necessary. It hadn't. She reached across and picked it up. The paper was heavier than standard. Gerald had always bought good stationery, one of his small, consistent indulgences, something she had teased him about more than once. The seal was intact, her name in his hand, as familiar as the sound of his voice on an ordinary evening. She held it in both hands. "Mrs. Hayward." Martin's tone shifted, careful, precise. "There's one more thing." She looked up. Gerald left instructions for someone else as well. A second set of directions separate from the estate, separate from everything I've shown you today. He held her gaze steadily. "When the time is right, I'll explain." Connie held the envelope and looked at Martin across the desk, the careful suit, the organized shelves, the ordinary Monday morning beyond the glass, and understood that Gerald, even from the very end of things, had still been thinking several moves ahead. It was, she thought, one of the things she had loved most about him. She sat in the car for 20 minutes before she started the engine. Not because she was composing herself, she had never been a woman who needed much time for that, but because she understood. In the particular way, she understood things that mattered, that what was in that envelope deserved better than a parking garage, and the sound of other people's doors opening and closing around her. She held it in both hands on the steering wheel and looked at her name in Gerald's handwriting, thought about his hands writing it, thought about the Tuesday afternoon, 11 days before the end, when he had sat in that chair and done what he always did when something needed doing. He had done it quietly, carefully, and without fanfare. Then she set the envelope on the passenger seat and drove home. The kitchen on Clover Mill Road was where they had always begun their days. Not the living room, not the dining room, but the kitchen, at the table by the window that looked out onto the backyard, where the light came in at a particular angle in the mornings and made everything feel unhurried. 2 cups of coffee, the newspaper Gerald insisted on getting in print long after everyone else had gone to their phones, and whatever the day was bringing toward them, held briefly at bay by the ordinary ritual of sitting together before the world required anything. She hadn't sat at that table much since March. It was the kind of place that felt different with only 1 cup. But she sat there now. She set the envelope on the table in front of her, smoothed it once with the flat of her hand, and opened it. The letter was 1 page. Gerald's handwriting throughout, not printed this time, but written in the slightly hurried cursive he used when he had things to say and was trying to keep pace with them. She had received enough notes from him over 26 years to know his writing in any light, at any angle. She could have identified it in a room full of other people's words. He had written it, she could see from the style, in one sitting. No corrections, no crossed-out lines. The way Gerald had always written when he was certain of what he meant. He told her he was sorry. Not for the things he had done, for the things he had chosen not to say. He had noticed the change in Ryan 8 months before the end. Small things at first, questions that felt like they had been prepared in advance. A knowledge of financial details Ryan had no reason to have, a habit of confirming things with Sasha before answering in a way that was new. He had said nothing to Connie because the first stroke had already frightened her, and he had not wanted to add to what she was carrying while he was the one in the hospital bed. He wrote, "I kept telling myself I would tell you when I was better, and then better stopped being an option." He had gone to Martin instead, done what he could through the documents, through the instructions he had left, through the careful arrangements that were the closest thing he had to a plan when his time for making plans was running short. He told her he had not been afraid, at the end, that he was more settled than he expected to be. And then, near the bottom of the page, in the slightly larger letters he used when something was important, "You were always the one who knew what to do with the numbers, Connie. Trust the numbers. Trust yourself." Below that, just his name, no elaboration, no final flourish. Just Gerald, the way he had signed birthday cards, and the occasional note left on the counter when he'd gone to the hardware store and expected to be back before she noticed. She read it twice. Then she folded it along its original creases carefully, the way it had been folded when it came out of the envelope, and held it for a moment in both hands. Outside the kitchen window, the backyard was November gray. The rose beds along the fence had gone dormant weeks ago. The bird feeder Gerald had installed 3 summers back needed refilling. She had been meaning to do it and hadn't gotten around to it, and every time she looked at it, she thought about getting around to it tomorrow. She thought about him writing that letter, about the afternoon in Martin's office, the walk back to wherever he had gone after, knowing what he had arranged and knowing also that he might not be there to see whether it worked, trusting that she would be. She opened the drawer in the kitchen table, the narrow one on the right side, the one Gerald had used for takeout menus and spare batteries, and the small things that didn't have another place. She put the letter inside, pressed it gently to the back, closed the drawer, turned the small lock with her thumbnail until it caught. She put her hands flat on the table and sat for a moment in the kitchen where they had begun every day for 22 years, in the light that was different now and would always be different now, and let herself be still. Then her phone rang. The name on the screen was Sasha. She looked at it for exactly 2 rings. Then she picked up. "Connie." The voice was warm, practiced warm, the kind she had learned, by now, to hear beneath the surface of. "Ryan and I have been talking. We think it's time to have a serious conversation about the house." Connie looked at the locked drawer, at the window where the bird feeder still needed filling, at the table where 2 cups had become 1. "Of course," she said. Her voice was even and pleasant and gave away absolutely nothing. "Why don't you tell me what you have in mind?" The call with Sasha had lasted 11 minutes. Connie had stood at the kitchen window the entire time, looking at the bird feeder, her voice unhurried and pleasant, agreeing to nothing specific and closing no doors. By the time she set the phone down, the meeting had been arranged for the following Saturday, the dining room, 2 o'clock, just to talk through some options. She had spent the week preparing. They arrived 7 minutes early, which told her something. People who arrived early to a meeting they had requested were either nervous or eager, and Ryan's expression when she opened the door suggested the former, while Sasha's suggested the latter. Ryan was in a button-down that still carried fold lines from the package, the same tell she had noticed at the memorial service, the wardrobe of a man dressing for an occasion he hadn't entirely chosen. Sasha wore something simple and professional, the kind of outfit selected to communicate reasonableness. Connie had made coffee, set out 3 cups. The dining room table was clear except for a notepad and pen on Connie's side. They sat, Ryan across from her, slightly to the left, Sasha directly opposite, a leather portfolio in front of her, closed. "We appreciate you making time for this," Sasha said. "Of course," Connie said. Ryan looked at the coffee cup in front of him, not at Connie. Sasha opened the portfolio after approximately 4 minutes of preliminary conversation, general concern for Connie's well-being, the challenges of managing an estate alone, the complexity of financial decisions during grief. Each point delivered with the smooth, practiced cadence of someone who had rehearsed the sequence and knew which words landed best. Then she produced the document. It was 4 pages, printed on clean white paper, paper-clipped at the corner. She placed it on the table and slid it across with 2 fingers, the way you slid something across a table when you wanted the gesture to seem casual. "This is just a precautionary arrangement," Sasha said. "A limited power of attorney, it would simply allow Ryan and me to assist with financial matters during this period. Sign documents on your behalf when needed. Make sure nothing falls through the cracks." She smiled the warm smile, the practiced one. Gerald would have wanted someone looking after things properly. Connie picked up the document. She read it the way she read every document, from the top, every line, every subordinate clause, every definition buried in the latter pages, where the language became dense enough that most people's attention began to drift. It took her 9 minutes. She was aware, during those 9 minutes, of the particular quality of the silence at the table, Ryan's stillness, which had the quality of a man holding his breath, and Sasha's, which had the quality of a woman waiting for a foregone conclusion. The document was not a limited power of attorney in any meaningful sense of the word limited. Page 1 established the basic framework: routine, financial assistance, bill payments, correspondence management, reasonable on its face, the kind of thing a concerned family member might genuinely propose. Page 2 introduced broader language. All financial instruments, not specific accounts, not defined assets, but all, as deemed necessary by the designated representatives, not by Connie, not with Connie's approval, but by Ryan and Sasha's own determination of necessity. Page 3 contained the provision that rendered everything else irrelevant, a clause granting authority to execute real estate transactions on Connie's behalf, including the right to list, negotiate, and finalize the sale of any property in which Connie held an interest, with a single signature from either designated representative, sufficient for completion. Page 4 was signature lines and notarization requirements. 6 provisions. 6 specific mechanisms by which the document would transfer meaningful control of Connie's finances, her accounts, and her home to 2 people who had, 11 days before Gerald passed, been comparative strangers. Patricia Ellison had signed something like this. Patricia Ellison no longer lived in her house. Connie set the document down on the table. She looked at Ryan. He was looking at his coffee cup, the cup he hadn't touched. She looked at Sasha. Sasha was looking at her with the composed, pleasant expression of a woman who had done this before and knew how the next 30 seconds were supposed to go. Connie reached for her pen. She watched Sasha's posture shift almost imperceptibly, the small physical adjustment of a person receiving the confirmation they expected, the slight settling of the shoulders, the beginning of a smile held back just long enough to seem gracious rather than triumphant. Connie drew a clean, deliberate line through the first flagged provision, then the second, then the third, fourth, fifth, and sixth. Each one struck through with the unhurried precision of someone who had been marking up documents for 31 years and found the work entirely unremarkable. She initialed each deletion, dated them. Then she signed the bottom of page 4. She slid the document back across the table. Sasha looked down at it. The smile had not disappeared exactly, it had frozen, the way expressions froze when the situation they were attached to had abruptly changed without the face receiving the update. Ryan finally looked up. "This is what I'll agree to," Connie said. Her voice was the same, even pleasant tone she had maintained since they arrived. Nothing more. The dining room was very quiet. Outside on Clover Mill Road, a neighbor's car backed out of a driveway. An ordinary Saturday afternoon, indifferent to everything happening at the table inside. Sasha picked up the document. She looked at the 6 crossed-out provisions, the initial deletions, the date, the signature below, and Connie watched her recalibrate. Not visibly. Just the small, almost cellular adjustment of a person whose plan had encountered something it hadn't accounted for. Ryan said nothing, but Connie noticed his shoulders, which had been rigid since he walked through the door, drop approximately 1 inch. Sasha had recalibrated quickly. Connie had expected that. What she hadn't expected, what she allowed herself to note as a data point worth tracking, was that the recalibration showed. Not dramatically, not in any way a casual observer would have named. But Connie was not a casual observer, and in the 6 weeks that followed the Saturday meeting, she watched Sasha Monroe operate with the particular attention of someone who had spent 3 decades finding the small inconsistencies that other people's systems tried to hide. The first sign came on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the dining room. Sasha arrived at 10 in the morning, no call ahead, which was new, carrying a container of something warm and moving through the front door with the ease of a person who had decided that ease was a statement worth making. She went directly to the kitchen, set the container on the counter, and began opening cabinets with the purposeful efficiency of a woman looking for bowls. Connie stood in the doorway and watched. It was a small thing, the cabinet opening, the assumption of access. But Connie had learned, over 31 years of reading documents and the people behind them, that the small assumptions were where the real intentions lived. A person who knocked before entering a room thought differently about ownership than one who walked in already reaching for the cabinets. "I know where the bowls are," Connie said. Her voice was pleasant. Sasha turned. And there, briefly, lasting perhaps a second and a half, was something that did not belong to the warm, patient, carefully composed version of herself she had been presenting for 6 months. A tightening around the eyes. A fractional pause before the smile arrived. It was the first time Connie had seen it. She filed it carefully away. The visits increased after that, 3 times the week following, twice the week after, each one carrying the language of concern-assisted living. "Connie, not because anything is wrong, just so you have options. A woman your age, managing a property this size. Gerald would have wanted you to be comfortable," the same phrases rotated with slight variations, deployed with the patient repetition of someone who believed that frequency eventually produced results. And alongside the visits came the paperwork. A second document, introduced casually on a Thursday afternoon as something a colleague had suggested broader than the first, the same provisions Connie had struck through reinstated with slightly different language, dressed in new paragraph structures as though rearranging the furniture would make the room unrecognizable. Connie read it at the table while Sasha watched and said she would need time to review it properly. She put it in the drawer beside Gerald's letter and did not mention it again. But something else was happening, quieter than the pressure and more interesting than the paperwork. Ryan was changing. It started small, the way things always started, Connie had learned. A question asked without first checking Sasha's expression. An answer given directly instead of being routed through a glance to the right. Small navigational adjustments in a man who had, for months, oriented himself entirely by someone else's compass. On a Wednesday, he fixed the gate latch at the back of the garden without being asked, and when Sasha mentioned they should discuss the property's maintenance costs, Ryan said it's fine. It took 10 minutes in the tone of a man who had decided something and wasn't interested in undeciding it. Sasha moved past it smoothly, but Connie had seen it. The evening that mattered came on a Thursday, 4 weeks after the dining room meeting. Sasha had left early, a prior commitment, apologetically mentioned, the kind of exit that was staged to seem spontaneous. Ryan stayed to finish his coffee. He did it the way people stayed when they had something they'd been carrying and had decided, finally, to set down. He was quiet for a while, looking at his cup, looking at the backyard through the kitchen window. At the bird feeder, Connie had finally refilled the previous weekend. Then he said, without looking up, "Did my dad ever say anything to you? About us? About Sasha?" Connie looked at him across the table. He was 31 years old, and in that moment, in the particular quality of the question careful and unguarded at the same time, the voice of a man who was genuinely asking rather than gathering information, she saw what Gerald had described in that letter. The man underneath the months of managed behavior, the son Gerald had loved and worried about and protected from his own generosity. She thought about the amended will, about the letter in the locked drawer, about everything Martin had told her and everything she had been building, carefully, in the months since. She gave him what she could. "Your father loved you very much, Ryan," she said. That was the one thing he was never uncertain about. Ryan nodded once. His jaw was tight. His eyes, when he finally looked up, had gone the reddish quality of a man who was not going to cry but had come close enough to know what it felt like. He stood, pushed his chair back, picked up his jacket from the back of it. "Thanks for the coffee," he said. She watched him walk down the porch steps and to his car, watched the taillights reach the end of Clover Mill Road and disappear. Then, her phone, face up on the kitchen counter, lit with a message from Beverly. She picked it up. "Sasha just hired a private attorney. She's moving faster than we expected." Connie set the phone down. She looked at the locked drawer, at the bird feeder, at the dark backyard beyond the glass where Gerald's garden had gone quiet for the winter. Then she picked up the phone and typed back, "Then we moved too." Moving and moving well were not the same thing. Connie had learned that distinction early in her first year of forensic work, when a senior colleague had watched her rush a preliminary finding to a client and had said, quietly, without judgment, "The numbers were right. The timing wasn't. Those are two different kinds of wrong." She had never forgotten it. In 31 years, it had saved her from more mistakes than any technical skill she had developed. So when she had typed then, "We moved too," she had meant it. She had also known exactly what moving well required. It required 1 more month. The dining room table had disappeared beneath the work. That was the only way to describe it. Beverly had arrived on a Friday evening with 2 accordion folders and the focused expression of a woman who had cleared her weekend, and by 10 o'clock, the surface of the table was a geography of documents organized into 7 distinct sections. Connie had made coffee at 6 and forgotten to drink it. The mug sat at the corner of the table. Room temperature. Ignored. The recording device photographs printed, dated, cross-referenced with the dates of Sasha's visits to establish a timeline of placement. The pattern documentation Connie had kept since October. Dates, conversation summaries, the specific phrases used to suggest memory failure, each one noted in the margins with the original context. The Nashville file. Beverly had assembled it comprehensively, public records from the property transfer, the court filings Patricia had made, the housing advocate's interview notes, the chain of document signings that had moved 31 years of Patricia's life out from under her in 8 months. Patricia had provided a signed written account 2 weeks after Connie's visit, careful and precise, every detail dated. The amended will, certified copies. Martin's documentation of Gerald's instructions, and the timeline of their execution. And the document Sasha had presented both versions, the original and the revised one, introduced 3 weeks later with its rearranged language and reinstated provisions annotated in Beverly's handwriting with the specific legal mechanisms each clause enabled. Beverly stood at the end of the table with her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, looking at the full spread the way she looked at things when she was deciding whether a case was ready. "This is enough," she said. "We have more than enough, Connie. We could file tomorrow." Connie was looking at the Nashville section, at Patricia's signed account, at the photograph of a woman in a blue cardigan in front of a house with flower boxes that no longer belonged to her. "I know," she said. "Then why are we waiting?" Connie looked up. She thought about how to say it accurately, not emotionally, but precisely, the way she tried to say everything that mattered. "Because of Ryan," she said. "If we move now, he finds out the way people find out when a decision has been made for them. He sees the documents, he sees the legal action, and whatever he does next, he does it because the situation forced him." She paused. "That's not the same as choosing." Beverly was quiet for a moment. "You think he's close?" "I think he asked me about his father 3 weeks ago in the tone of a man who already knew something was wrong and was looking for permission to trust it." Connie moved to her side of the table and straightened a stack of papers that didn't need straightening. "If I move before he gets there himself, I take that away from him. He never fully steps out from under it, he just trades one person making decisions for him for another." Beverly considered this for a long moment. Then she nodded, once, in the particular way she nodded when she disagreed with a strategy but respected the reasoning behind it. "One condition," Beverly said. "We're ready to file the moment you say go. Everything notarized, everything organized, everything ready to be in an attorney's hands within 24 hours. "Agreed." They worked for another 2 hours. Beverly organized the final sections. Connie drafted a chronological summary, 2 pages, dense, the kind of document that could be handed to a stranger and understood completely without additional explanation. By midnight, everything was in order. Beverly left at 12:30. Connie walked through the house turning off lights, the dining room, the hallway, the kitchen, until only the small lamp in the study remained. She stood at the window and looked out at Clover Mill Road, at the quiet street, at the neighbors' houses dark and ordinary in the November night. She thought about Sasha recalibrating, about the private attorney Beverly had flagged, about the second document with its rearranged language, about a woman who had done this before and succeeded and had no particular reason to believe this time would be different. "Come on, Sasha," she thought. "Show me everything you've got." She reached for the lamp. The phone rang. She looked at the screen. 11:04, a number she recognized. She answered. "Connie." Sasha's voice was different, stripped of the warm, practiced register she had maintained for 7 months. What was underneath it was quieter and considerably less pleasant. "I think we should be honest with each other." Connie said nothing. She waited. "You're a smart woman," Sasha said. "I've always thought that. But smart women sometimes hold on to things longer than they should." A pause. Calibrated. "I think we both know how this ends. The question is, how difficult you want to make it." The study was very quiet. Outside, the street was still. Connie looked at the lamp she hadn't turned off yet, at the window, at the dark shape of the oak tree at the edge of the property Gerald's oak, planted the second year they lived in the house, tall enough now that it cleared the roofline by 6 feet. "Good night, Sasha," she said. She ended the call, turned off the lamp, stood for a moment in the dark study. Then she went to bed, and she slept without difficulty, which was the thing she had not expected and which told her, more clearly than anything else could have, that she was ready. 3 days. That was the distance between Sasha's phone call and the moment Connie stood on the front walkway of the house on Clover Mill Road with 2 grocery bags in her hands and a key that no longer worked. She had known it was coming. Not the precise day, not the exact method, but the shape of it, yes. She had recognized the phone call for what it was. Not a negotiation, not a warning in the way warnings were meant to give you time to change course. It was the sound of a plan entering its final stage. Sasha had decided the careful approach had run its course, and what came after careful was fast. Connie had spent those 3 days accordingly. She set the grocery bags down by the porch railing the same way she had set down every difficult thing in her life, without drama, without announcement. The rotisserie chicken, the milk, the bananas just beginning to spot at the tips. A magazine with a pumpkin on the cover, because October had always been her favorite month, and she saw no reason to let the day take that from her too. She had called Beverly from the car before she got out. Beverly was 23 minutes away. 23 minutes was enough time. She pulled the wicker chair, Gerald's yard sale chair, the one with good bones, to its usual angle and sat down. The afternoon light was doing its October thing, coming in low and gold and making everything look like something worth keeping. She folded her hands in her lap and waited with the particular quality of stillness that belonged to people who had done their preparation and were no longer in a hurry. Inside, she could see movement through the front window. Ryan, near the hallway. Sasha, further back, the composed stillness of a person monitoring a situation she believed she controlled. Connie looked at the oak tree at the edge of the property. Gerald's oak. Tall enough now to clear the roofline by 6 feet. She had refilled the bird feeder that morning. The front door opened at the 4-minute mark. Ryan came out alone. He was in the button-down with the fold lines again, the wardrobe of a man dressing for an occasion he hadn't chosen, the same tell she had been reading since the memorial service. He pulled the door most of the way closed behind him. Not all the way. Sasha would be able to hear. He stood at the top of the porch steps and looked at everything except Connie's face, the railing, the grocery bags, the middle distance somewhere past her left shoulder. Connie, he stopped. Started again. Sasha thinks it's better if there's more space. While things get sorted out, she thinks it would help if... He stopped again. The words were Sasha's. Connie could hear the seams of them, the careful phrasing that had been prepared in another room and was now being delivered by someone who had not fully committed to the delivery. She had heard that particular rhythm before. In deposition rooms, from witnesses reading from notes they were trying not to look like they were reading from. She let the silence sit for a moment. Not aggressively, just long enough for Ryan to hear himself in it. Then she said quietly, "Ryan." He looked at her. Finally, directly. "Your father left you something," she said. "I've been waiting for the right time to give it to you." The porch was very still. Down the street, a neighbor's dog was barking at something it would lose interest in shortly. Somewhere up the block, the sound of a car door, ordinary and unhurried. The world conducting its late afternoon business with complete indifference to what was happening on the porch of the house on Clover Mill Road. Ryan had gone very still. It was a different stillness than the one he had arrived with. That one had been the stillness of a man holding himself in a prepared position, waiting for a scripted exchange to follow its expected path. This was something else. The stillness of a man who had just heard something that had reached past the prepared position and touched something underneath it. His eyes, when they stayed on her face, were the eyes she had seen 3 weeks ago at the kitchen table. The man who had asked about his father in the tone of someone who already knew the answer mattered. He did not look toward the front door. For the first time since he had walked out onto the porch, he did not check the door for a signal. Connie held his gaze and waited. She was good at waiting. She had always been good at waiting. 31 years of it had made patience less a virtue than simply a method, the most reliable one she had. The door opened. Sasha came out with the controlled efficiency of a person who had been listening and had decided the conversation had gone far enough in the wrong direction. She was still composed. The composure was the last thing to go with her. Connie had observed, but there was something underneath it now that hadn't been visible in the dining room, or the kitchen, or the 7 months of careful visits with their warm smiles and practiced concern. She stood at the top of the steps beside Ryan and looked at Connie with the particular directness of someone who had decided that the performance was no longer the most efficient tool available. "Whatever Gerald wrote," Sasha said, her voice stripped of its usual warmth, precise and final, "doesn't change anything." The words landed on the porch, the way she had intended them to, like a door being closed. Connie looked at her calmly. She did not respond. There was no response necessary, and she had learned long ago that silence, in the right moment, said more than any sentence she could have constructed. Then, at the far end of Clover Mill Road, a pair of headlights appeared. Moving at an unhurried pace up the street, the particular pace of someone who knew where they were going and had arrived at exactly the time they intended to arrive, 23 minutes. Beverly was never late. The car came to a stop in front of the house at the unhurried pace of people who had somewhere specific to be and had arrived at the time they intended. Beverly got out first, the driver's side, her accordion folder under one arm, the particular focused expression she wore when she had prepared thoroughly and was ready to use every bit of it. Connie had seen that expression in conference rooms and across kitchen tables for 30 years, and it had never once failed to mean what it looked like it meant. Then the passenger door opened. Martin Cole stepped out. He was in the same careful suit he had worn to every meeting Connie had ever had with him, dark, precise, the kind that communicated that the person inside it took the present moment seriously. He carried a slim leather document case. He looked at the porch with the measured calm of a man who had been waiting for this particular moment for 3 months and had spent the intervening time making sure everything was in order. Connie watched Sasha see him. It was not the fractional tightening around the eyes she had observed in the kitchen 6 weeks ago. It was not the recalibration she had seen after the dining room meeting. This was different, a visible stillness that moved through Sasha's posture from the shoulders down. The stillness of a person whose internal calculation had just encountered a variable it hadn't prepared for. A lawyer she didn't know, arriving with Beverly Marsh, at a moment she had designed to be entirely controlled. For the first time in 7 months, Sasha Monroe had no immediate response. Martin came up the porch steps with Beverly and nodded to Connie, a brief, professional acknowledgement between two people who had spoken that morning and knew what came next. He looked at Ryan with the straightforward attention of a man who had known his father for 19 years. "Ryan," he said, "my name is Martin Cole. I was your father's attorney. There are things you need to hear." Ryan looked at him, then at Beverly, then at Connie. The fold lines in his button-down, the tell she had been reading since March, seemed somehow more pronounced in the late afternoon light, the wardrobe of a man still dressed for someone else's occasion, standing at the edge of understanding that the occasion had just changed entirely. He stepped back from the doorway. Martin set the document case on the porch railing and opened it. He produced a bound set of papers, certified copies, Connie knew, the originals secured in the private safe on East Main Street where they had been since the Tuesday Gerald had walked in 11 days before the end. He presented the amended will with the same unhurried precision he brought to everything. The date of execution, the witnesses, the specific amendment language, the provisions it superseded. He did not editorialize. He did not need to. Gerald's words, in Gerald's instructions, carried their own weight. Sasha found her voice on the second page. "That document has no standing," she said. Her tone had recovered some of its evenness, not the warmth that was gone, but the control. An amendment filed without the knowledge of the primary beneficiaries, without notice, prepared under circumstances that can be challenged. The amendment was executed in full compliance with Virginia Code, Martin said, without looking up from the page. Witnessed by 2 licensed attorneys, filed under separate seal with proper documentation of your husband's capacity and intent at the time of signing. He turned to the next page. "I anticipated this objection. The response is on page 4. Sasha looked at page 4. She said nothing. Beverly moved. She set her accordion folder on the porch railing beside Martin's case and drew out a section Connie recognized, the Nashville file, assembled over 3 weeks in November, organized with the thoroughness Beverly brought to everything she considered important, which was most things. She placed it on the small table beside the wicker chair. Photographs on top, Patricia Ellison in front of her house with the flower boxes, the same image Connie had first seen on Beverly's laptop at the dining room table. Below it, the timeline, the property transfer documents, the pattern Beverly had reconstructed from public records, and Patricia's signed account. Then Beverly placed a second document beside the first, a sworn written statement. Patricia Ellison's signature at the bottom, notarized 3 months ago in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. 8 pages, single-spaced. Ryan had come fully out onto the porch at some point during this. Connie couldn't have said exactly when, because she had been watching Sasha. He stood near the railing, not touching it, looking down at the documents on the table with the expression of a man reading something that was rearranging things inside him faster than he could keep up with the rearranging. His eyes moved from the photograph of Patricia to the timeline, from the timeline to the pattern documentation, from the pattern to the phrases Beverly had highlighted, the specific sentences, the exact words, the approach Sasha had used in Nashville and had then used again, with the same language and the same sequence, in the house on Clover Mill Road. He picked up the highlighted page. He read it. He set it down. He looked at Sasha. Is this true? 3 words. Quiet. No performance in them, not anger, not accusation, just the sound of a man asking a question he needed the answer to and was no longer willing to have answered for him. Sasha looked back at him. The composure was still there, the last layer of it, the structural composure of a person who had not yet arrived at the place where it fell. She was calculating. Connie could see it, running through the available responses, measuring each one against the documents on the table and the people on the porch, and the fact that Martin Cole was standing 3 feet away with certified copies of a will she had not known existed. She did not answer. The silence stretched. Down the street, the neighbor's dog had stopped barking. The October light had shifted from gold to the flatter, cooler quality of late afternoon moving toward evening. Somewhere inside the house, a clock ticked with the complete indifference of objects that kept their function regardless of what the people around them were doing. Ryan set the page down on the table. He turned away from Sasha. He turned toward Connie, and his face, in that moment, had the particular quality of a man who had just put down something very heavy and was not yet sure what to do with his empty hands. "Where's the letter Dad left?" he said. His voice was different, not the managed, prepared voice of the past 7 months, not the uncertain voice of a man checking expressions before he finished sentences. Just his voice. "You said he left me something. Where is it?" Connie stood up from the wicker chair without hurrying. "Give me a moment," she said. She went inside. The kitchen was quiet. The afternoon light came through the window at its low October angle, falling across the table where 2 cups had become 1. She reached into the back of the cabinet above the refrigerator, the high shelf Gerald had always used for things that needed to be kept safely out of the ordinary reach of daily life. The envelope was the same cream color as the first one, same weight paper, same careful seal. On the front, in Gerald's slightly right-leaning print, Ryan. Martin had given it to Connie 6 weeks after their first meeting, once he had determined that the time Gerald specified had arrived. Gerald's instructions had been precise. Give it to Ryan when he's ready to receive it. Connie will know when that is. She had known this morning, when she refilled the bird feeder and understood, with the particular clarity that came after long preparation, that today was the day. She carried the envelope back to the porch. Ryan was standing where she had left him, near the railing. Beverly had stepped to the far end of the porch with the quiet tact of someone who understood which moments required witnesses and which required space. Martin stood near the steps. Document case closed, his professional role complete, his presence now simply human. Connie held out the envelope. Ryan looked at it, at his name in his father's handwriting. Something moved through his face, not tears, just the expression of a person encountering something they hadn't known they were waiting for until it was in front of them. He took it. He looked at Connie once, a look that asked nothing and said everything, and walked to the porch steps and sat down. He broke the seal carefully, unfolded the single page. He read. The porch was very quiet. The October light continued its slow shift toward evening. Somewhere down the street, a child called out and the sound faded. The ordinary world, doing what it always did. Connie did not watch him read. She already knew what the letter said. Martin had summarized it when explaining the second set of instructions. Gerald had not written about Sasha, had not listed grievances or made accusations. That had not been Gerald's way, and it was not what Ryan needed. Instead, Gerald had written about a Saturday afternoon when Ryan was 12 years old. A 1,987 pickup truck in the driveway. Gerald rebuilding a carburetor, a project above his actual skill level, undertaken with the stubbornness of a man who believed effort compensated for expertise. Ryan had sat on an overturned bucket for 3 hours, handing tools when asked, and at one point quietly correcting a component Gerald had assembled wrong. Gerald had written, "I pretended not to notice that you noticed. But I noticed. You always knew right from wrong, son. Even then, even with a carburetor. Is this the man you want to be?" Ryan folded the page. He sat with the letter held in both hands, face pressed into the paper, the posture of a man absorbing something he would have preferred to absorb with more time and more privacy. His shoulders moved once, controlled, and then went still. He sat that way long enough that the silence became its own presence. Then he stood. He turned and looked at Sasha with an expression Connie had not seen on his face in 7 months. Not angry, not cold. Simply clear the face of a man who had found his way back to what he actually thought and had decided to stand in it. "I want you to leave," he said. Sasha looked at him. The last layer of composure remained, but its quality had changed, no longer the composure of control, but of a person calculating a final position. "Ryan." Her voice was low, deliberate. "If you do this, you lose everything. The life we built, the plans, everything we've worked toward. You walk away from me. You walk away from all of it." Ryan looked at her for a long moment. A breeze moved through the oak tree at the edge of the yard, Gerald's oak, planted the second year they lived here, tall enough now to clear the roofline. The kind of breeze that visited briefly before the real cold arrived. "I already lost everything," Ryan said, "the moment I stopped thinking for myself." He looked down at the folded letter in his hand. Then he looked up, not at Sasha, not at Martin or Beverly, but at Connie. In that look was something she recognized, because she had felt it herself in a hospital hallway 7 months ago. The particular quiet devastation of a loss that was also, in some way that was hard to name but impossible to miss, the beginning of something else entirely. She gave him a small nod. It was enough. The 2 weeks that followed were the most deliberately paced of Connie's life. Martin filed the necessary responses within 48 hours of Sasha's attorney submitting the petition, which arrived, as Beverly had predicted, 3 days after the confrontation on Clover Mill Road. It claimed undue influence in the amended will's execution and questioned Gerald's capacity at signing. Thorough, professionally constructed, and considerably less formidable than it would have been if Martin hadn't spent 3 months preparing for precisely this argument. Beverly coordinated with Patricia's advocate in Tennessee. Connie called Patricia on a Sunday evening. "I know why you're calling," Patricia said before Connie could explain. "Beverly already asked. I already said yes." The Richmond courthouse on a Tuesday morning in December had the particular quality of public buildings in winter-high ceilings, marble floors, the institutional stillness of a place where private matters were resolved in public language. Martin arranged his documents at the left table with unhurried efficiency. Beverly sat beside him, accordion folder open. Sasha arrived at 8:58 with her attorney, a man in an expensive suit, who carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to expensive rooms. Sasha was composed in the way she was always composed. She glanced at the left table once with the inventory assessment Connie had first noticed at Gerald's memorial service. She did not look at Connie again. Martin presented the case methodically, the amended will, Gerald's documented capacity, the timeline of estate administration, the 2 documents Sasha had introduced, and Connie had declined to sign in full. He presented the recording device photographs, the dated pattern of visits, the financial questions and memory suggestions cataloged over 7 months. Sasha's attorney objected at measured intervals. Each objection was addressed. The exchange had the quality of a conversation in which one side had prepared for every direction, and the other was discovering, incrementally, that the ground was less solid than it had appeared. At 10:15, Beverly stood. "Your Honor, we have one more witness." The courtroom door opened. Patricia Ellison came through it in a wheelchair, a practical concession to a long drive, not to any diminishment of the woman in the chair. She wore a navy dress, white hair neatly arranged, posture as straight as the chair allowed. Her hands were folded in her lap with the stillness Connie recognized from room 14 at Meadowbrook, the stillness of a woman who had learned that precision was the only currency that hadn't been taken from her. She looked at the courtroom carefully. Then she looked at Sasha. In 7 months, Connie had cataloged every small loss of Sasha's control, the fractional eye tightening, the recalibration, the structural composure that held, even when the ground shifted. She had not yet seen this. Sasha went still in a way that had nothing to do with composure. Not the stillness of a person controlling their response, the stillness of a person whose response system had encountered something it had no category for. Her attorney said something low beside her. She did not appear to hear it. Patricia was sworn in. She testified for 31 minutes. She spoke the way she had spoken in room 14 carefully, in sequence, without editorializing. The first visit, the soup, the questions about the property, the gentle suggestions that she was forgetting things she hadn't forgotten, the documents introduced as a precaution, the signatures obtained in a room arranged to make refusal feel unreasonable. 8 months, the house with the flower boxes that no longer belonged to her. She did not look at Sasha while she spoke. She looked at the judge. When she finished, the courtroom held the particular quiet that settled when the most important thing in the room had just been said plainly. The judge, mid-50s, reading glasses on a chain, the measured attention of someone who knew the difference between a performance and a record, looked at the right table. "Do you have anything to say?" Sasha turned to her attorney. A brief exchange, low enough that the room couldn't hear. Then he straightened and gave a single small shake of his head. The judge made a note, looked at the documents, looked at Patricia. "This court finds no basis for the petition. It is denied." She made another note. When she looked up, her voice carried the weight of a statement being chosen carefully. "The actions described in the testimony and documentation before this court raise serious concerns that fall outside the scope of today's proceeding. This matter will be referred for further review by the appropriate office." Sasha did not move. Her attorney wrote something on his legal pad, underlined it, and did not show it to her. Martin closed his folder. Beverly capped her pen. Connie looked at neither of them. She looked at Patricia Ellison. Patricia unfolded her hands in her lap and placed them flat on her knees, a small, private gesture that no one else in the room appeared to notice. Connie noticed. 4 years Patricia had carried this. 4 years of telling a true story in rooms that couldn't do anything with it. And now, on a Tuesday morning in December, in a courthouse with marble floors and high ceilings, the record had been corrected. Not everything that needed correcting. Not yet. But enough for today. Enough for today was enough. The key was new. That was the first thing, the small, solid fact of it, as Connie stood on the front porch of the house on Clover Mill Road on a Thursday morning in December, 1 week after the courthouse, and fit the newly cut key into the newly installed lock. The locksmith had come on a Wednesday, 2 days after the petition was denied, at Beverly's recommendation and Connie's long overdue instruction. The lock turned cleanly. No resistance. No history in the mechanism. She pushed the door open and went inside. The house was the same. The hallway with the coat rack Gerald had built from reclaimed wood and been unreasonably proud of. The kitchen visible at the end of the corridor, morning light across the floor at the particular angle it always came in December, lower than October, longer shadows. The study to the left, with the bookshelf where she had found what she had found and photographed and left in place, which Beverly had since removed and documented in the way things were properly documented when they became part of a formal record. Same house, different air. The kind of difference that wasn't about anything physical, not the smell or the light or the arrangement of furniture. It was the difference that came when something that had been sitting in a space, invisible but present, had finally been named and addressed and was no longer there. Connie stood in the hallway and felt the house the way she hadn't felt it in 7 months. Quiet. Just quiet. She made coffee and stood at the kitchen window and looked at the backyard, the dormant garden, the bird feeder, Gerald's oak. She thought about the courthouse on Tuesday, about Patricia's hands unfolding in her lap, about Martin closing his folder with the small, precise motion of a man whose work had been completed correctly. The legal outcomes had followed quickly, the way outcomes followed when the record was clear and complete. The amended will had been upheld without further challenge. Gerald's capacity fully documented, his intentions unambiguous. The estate remained as he had arranged it. The matter referred for further review had moved to the appropriate offices in both Richmond and Nashville. Connie did not know, and Martin had advised her not to speculate about what that process would produce or how long it would take. What she knew was that Patricia Ellison's account was now part of an official record in 2 states, filed by people whose job it was to do something with it. That was more than it had been a year ago. 3 days after the courthouse, Ryan had filed the paperwork to end his marriage. Beverly had mentioned it without commentary, because Beverly understood which information required response and which simply required acknowledgement. Connie had acknowledged it and said nothing further. That was Ryan's process. And it belonged to him. He came on a Saturday. She heard the car in the driveway and looked through the kitchen window and recognized the vehicle, the same one she had watched pull away from Clover Mill Road dozens of times in the past 7 months, always with 2 people in it, always leaving her at the door. This time it was just Ryan. He knocked. That was new too. He had not knocked on this door since before Gerald passed, had always come in with the ease of family, which was how Gerald had wanted it and how Connie had tried to maintain it. The knock was the sound of a man who understood that things had changed and was asking, rather than assuming. She opened the door. He looked thinner than she remembered from the porch 2 weeks ago, the particular thinness of someone who had not been sleeping or eating with much intention. He was in a jacket and plain clothes, nothing pressed, nothing chosen for an occasion, just himself. "I should have called," he said. "You're here," she said. "Come in." She made more coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table, Ryan in the chair that had been Gerald's chair, the one closest to the window, which felt right in a way that Connie didn't need to say out loud. She set a mug in front of him and sat across from him and waited, because Ryan had come here with something and she had learned, with everyone who mattered, that the thing people came with was worth waiting for. He wrapped both hands around the mug, looked at it. "I'm sorry, Connie," he said. "I didn't see it. I knew something was wrong. I think I knew for a long time, but I didn't let myself see it." "Your father did," she said. "That's why he wrote to you." Ryan was quiet for a moment. Outside, a bird landed on the feeder and departed. The December light held the yard in its flat, clear way. "He wasn't angry at me," Ryan said. "It wasn't quite a question." "No," Connie said. "He was never angry at you." Ryan nodded. The nodding had the quality of a person filing something away in a place where it could actually be kept. Connie stood and went to the study. The drawer she opened was not the locked one. That one held Gerald's letter, which was where it would stay. This drawer held the things she had been deciding about for 3 months, since the morning after she had reread Gerald's letter and understood that what he had prepared wasn't only for her. She came back to the kitchen with the watch. Gerald had worn it every day for 22 years, a simple thing, a stainless band and a clean face, the kind of watch chosen for reliability over appearance. She had taken it from his wrist at the hospital and put it in the drawer and not known what to do with it until now. She set it on the table between them. Ryan looked at it for a long time without touching it. Then he picked it up carefully, the way you picked up something that had been someone else's and was now yours to take care of. He looked at it, looked at Connie. "Can I come back?" he said. "Not about the estate or any of that, just to talk, sometimes." The kitchen was warm. Outside, the December morning continued at its unhurried pace, the bare oak tree and the feeder and the garden that would come back in the spring because that was what gardens with good roots did. "The door's open, Ryan," Connie said. He nodded once, turned the watch over in his hands. And for the first time since Gerald's service, in the house on Clover Mill Road where things had almost gone very wrong and had instead gone the way Gerald had quietly, carefully arranged for them to go, something that had been broken began, in the small and ordinary way that broken things sometimes did, to consider the possibility of mending. It was a Tuesday in March when Connie first noticed the difference. She woke at 6:15 not because anything required it, not because a call was expected or a document needed reviewing, just the ordinary hour her body had kept for 30 years. She put on coffee, stood at the kitchen window while it brewed, and looked at the backyard. The garden was coming back. Not dramatically, it was March, not May, and the rose beds Gerald had planted along the back fence were still more structure than color. But there was green at the base of things, the particular insistent green of plants that had decided, without consulting anyone, that it was time. The bird feeder needed refilling. She made a note to do it after coffee. She sat at the table, wrapped both hands around the mug, and thought about nothing specific for a few minutes. That was new. That was the difference. The updates had arrived gradually, the way resolutions came not in a single moment, but in smaller ones that accumulated into something solid. Patricia Ellison had received a partial settlement 3 weeks earlier. Beverly had called with the news on a Wednesday evening, her voice carrying the satisfaction of a woman who had watched a process produce what it was supposed to produce. It was not everything Patricia had been clear-eyed about that from the beginning, but it was documented and official, and what had happened to her was now part of a record that could not be quietly rearranged. Beverly had reopened her own practice in February, a small office on the north side of Richmond, the deliberate restart of a woman who had decided it was time to do the right thing formally rather than quietly. She had 3 clients already. Ryan came every Sunday. It had begun the week after the December kitchen visit and continued without discussion, the way habits formed when they were filling something real. He always brought coffee from the place on Grove Avenue. They talked about ordinary things, mostly a book he was reading, a project at work, the oak tree that needed trimming on one side, occasionally something less ordinary. He was finding his way back to himself in the gradual manner of someone relearning familiar terrain after a long absence. Connie did not interfere with that. The most useful thing you could do for a person finding their footing was to make sure the ground near you was solid. She was on her second cup when she thought about Gerald's letter. Just the last line, the one she had carried every month since. Trust the numbers. Trust yourself. She had thought, reading it the first time, that he meant the financial documentation, the records, the evidence, the paper trail that stood up in a Richmond courtroom on a Tuesday in December. And he had meant that. Gerald had always been precise. But sitting here on a March morning with coffee and birdsong outside the window, she understood the numbers were larger than any single set of documents. The numbers were the things that didn't change when you looked away from them. The things that held their value regardless of who was in the room or how the story was being arranged around them. 31 years of forensic work had taught her that the truth about a situation lived in the details handled when no one was watching, the folder slightly out of place, the timestamp that didn't match, the small inconsistency that pulled apart under the simplest pressure. You could build a false narrative. People did it all the time. But you couldn't change what had actually happened. The record of actual events existed independent of any story told about them. If you were patient enough, precise enough, and willing to do the work, it was always there. That was what Gerald had trusted in her, not just the accounting. The instinct underneath it, the thing that had made her sit on a wicker chair instead of reacting, photograph instead of remove, wait for Ryan to reach his own understanding instead of delivering it like a verdict. Trust what you know. Trust how you know it. She was still sitting with that thought when she heard the car. She looked at the microwave clock. 8:47. Ryan came Sundays at 10. Reliably. The way Gerald had always been reliable about the things that mattered. She looked through the kitchen window. His car was in the driveway, an hour and 13 minutes early, which meant either something was wrong or something was right. The way he got out, no hurry. Jacket over one arm, the paper bag from Grove Avenue in his hand, suggested right. Connie smiled. She stood, went to the cabinet, and took down a second mug. Before the next story begins, I want to ask you something. Connie found that recording device, and she didn't touch it. She photographed it, went outside to make her calls, and waited 7 months. Would you have done the same? Or would you have confronted Sasha the moment you found it and said exactly what you were thinking? Tell me in the comments. And tell me where you're watching from, what city, what country, what time it is where you are right now. If this story stayed with you, if you found yourself thinking about Connie at the kitchen table, or Patricia in room 14, or the way Gerald wrote a letter he hoped she'd never need, subscribe. Because the next story starts exactly where this one ends. And it begins with a name nobody saw coming.